In the Pokemon TCG, skill matters a lot. It's practically common sense that it matters significantly more than luck when it comes to performing well in competitive tournaments. As such, when picking a deck for an event, top players often gravitate towards decks with solid consistency and the highest agency when piloting them, with agency being how much you can win games by outplaying the opponent with the deck. One of the go-to high agency archetypes in almost any Pokemon TCG format is of course the control deck. Control strategies aim to, as the name suggests, control the board. And they do this through many different means, such as energy disruption, hand disruption, retreat disruption, prize manipulation, and resource manipulation, just to name a few. But over time, despite control strategies remaining some of the best in the game in most formats, the nature of the archetype started to change in a way that I'm not sure any other strategy has seen. In the last year, it's not a stretch to say control has been, funnily enough, a luck-based strategy, and maybe the most high variance archetype to pilot. So today, I'm here to break down the main reasons control has gone from an archetype defined by high skill and outplay potential to where it is in the present, where a great player will lose games significantly more than ever before. Control decks have been around since the game's inception, but in order to understand the fall of control in Standard, we need to take it back to 2017. In the Crimson Invasion expansion in Sun and Moon, arguably the worst Pokemon TCG expansion ever for competitive viability, the control decks that would go on to dominate mid-era Sun and Moon formats were born. Lusamine is one of the most poorly designed cards in Pokemon TCG history. It's a supporter card that allows you to put 2 in any combination of supporter cards and stadiums from the discard pile into your hand. The reason this card is so flawed is that you can grab another copy of Lusamine with one Lusamine, meaning you could infinitely loop resources by playing Lusamine, grabbing one Lusamine from the discard pile and another supporter or stadium, and then you would loop from there with the other Lusamine. The main supporters grabbed were Rocket's Handiwork, which milled cards from the top of the deck pretty inconsistently, Guzma for infinite gusting and switching, and of course Acerola. If you're familiar with Penny, it's basically just that, except Acerola can pick up any Pokemon as long as it has damage on it, and it puts all attached cards into your hand as well. Also in this set, Regigigas was released, which was a single prize Pokemon with 180 HP, with Ancient Crystal releasing in Ultra Prism a few months later, which reduces the damage done to Regi Pokemon by 30. It became a solid neutral wall option to loop with Acerola if the opponent was forced into a 3-hit knockout. If the opponent needed 3 hits to KO the wall, then you could tank a hit, Lusamine for Lusamine and Acerola, tank another hit, bench another Gigas, Acerola and promote the new one, tank the next hit, and repeat forever. Also, Counter Catcher was printed in this set, and if you've ever played Standard format in the last 2 years, I don't think I need to tell you how good Counter Catcher is in control decks. However, the other big addition, and the one I really want to start today's video with, is Gladion. Gladion lets you look at your face down prize cards, put any card from them into your hand, put the Gladion into your prize cards, and then shuffle them face down. It's essentially the same thing as Hisuian Heavy Ball from Astral Radiance, except that it can work for any card and not just basic Pokemon. But we will get to Hisuian Heavy Ball in a little bit. Anyways, Gladion was not a very good card in most archetypes, especially on release, since Town Map was just seen as better for any deck that aimed to take prize cards. And with how decks were built in this era, Gladion just wasn't even remotely worth using your supporter for the turn. However, Gladion found a permanent home as a 1 or 2 of in every control deck, since these decks often don't take prize cards as their main strategy, and thus they can't easily access their key resources that might get stuck in the prize cards, like the surplus of one-of tech cards for specific matchups these decks often run. Gladion could circumvent this, and just by existing in the game, it removed so much luck from the game for control decks. It allowed for way more flexibility, and maybe most importantly, it saved you deck space. Although it sounds weird at first, in reality, playing one Gladion in your deck could potentially save your deck up to 10 card spaces. This is because of the dilemma control decks used to run into, and as I'll get into later, the one that they still currently do. Let's say you have a tech card that is 100% essential to beating a popular matchup, but you truly only need to use one copy of this card for the line to work. Considering how important the card is, if you ran it as a one-of, then without a card like Gladion, prizing it could instantly lose you the game in that matchup, and as we'll get into later, losing a game with control is a death sentence. But playing 2 copies of it just feels inefficient, despite being necessary to remove as much variance as possible from your matches. Gladion changed everything, since now Control could essentially run everything as a one-of and just rely on 1 or 2 Gladion to fix prize cards. Gladion was a huge factor as to why Control was so good during Sun and Moon, but once it rotated, problems instantly started to appear. While Oranguru, Mill, and Control decks were some of the best in the game for a while at the start of Sword and Shield, they were often some of the least consistent decks to win games with, unless you were really good. This was largely a combination of their playstyle, limited deck space, limited resources, and high likelihood for prize card variance. Still, good players found success with these decks because the skill ceiling and agency were so high that it could offset some bad luck. However, once Oranguru rotated in 2020, Control really started to struggle. Some of its best lines were taken away, and aiming to beat everything, as Control often does, was completely impossible, since you couldn't physically tech enough to remove most common bad matchups without sacrificing consistency and prize card security. Control was starting to look completely dead in certain formats during the Sword and Shield era, until some of the later Sword and Shield expansions came to save the day. With the release of Control staples like Silene, Miltank, Yveltal, Yelchir, and 2 new prize manipulation cards, Control started to perform well again at the end of Sword and Shield. Peonia from Chilling Reign is the best prize card manipulation card Control decks have ever seen. It allows you to draw 3 of your face down prize cards, and then you put 3 cards from your current hand back in those places in any way you like. This was quite possibly the most perfect card Control decks could have asked for. You could fish out all 6 prize cards if you wanted. You could put dead cards or other matchup specific tech cards back in the prizes to never see them again. You could choose the order and remember where every resource in your deck was, and with Palpad and Silene, you could recycle it as many times as you needed to. Peonia was the backbone for Sander Wojcik's top 4 NAIC 2022 Mewtwo V-Union stall deck. Peonia was so essential to this deck because it grabbed the vital Mewtwo V-Union pieces and other necessary tech cards out of prize cards that you needed to win. Peonia was to be played pretty much every game, as it almost always provided more value than not when used for the first or second time. With Peonia saving deck space similar to how Gladion did, more one-of tech cards and greedier resource lines could be justified, making an ideal scenario of 100% good meta matchups somewhat possible in some formats. Whether it was Mewtwo V-Union, the Yveltal spam Control decks during the Lugia meta, Pidgeot Control once Obsidian Flames released, or obviously Snorlax stall after Paradox Rift release, Peonia was a 100% inclusion. And in some decks it was usually at a 2-of because of how bad prizing your 1 Peonia was in a deck like Mewtwo. However, Peonia wasn't the only prize card manipulation card Control decks could use during Sword and Shield. Hisuian Heavy Ball from Astral Radiance is just like Gladion, except for retrieving any card and being a supporter. This item card just reveals a basic Pokemon from the prizes, puts it into your hand, and shuffles the Heavy Ball in. This once again could save deck space, since you could basically just run all of your Pokemon as a one-of and play 1 Heavy Ball, and usually you would be fine, since the odds of prizing both Heavy Ball and a key Pokemon were quite low. For reference, Gardevoir, Grimmsnarl, and Charizard almost always play just 2 copies of their namesake Pokemon, and it's an unwritten rule that if you play 2 copies of something, it means that it won't be prized. This obviously isn't 100% true, but 2 copies reduces as much variance as possible while saving as much deck space as possible. After Peonia rotated in 2024, Heavy Ball became the only prize retriever in the format, but it was so good at what it did that Control continued to perform very well. Snorlax and Pidgeot Control both won regionals, with countless top cuts over the next year until rotation. Just take a look at Alessandro Cremasoli's second place Pidgeot Control list from Stockholm Regionals. This list is beyond greedy, and honestly isn't all that consistent, but it was just consistent enough and just greedy enough to work in the format. However, the moment rotation hit, Control was clearly dead. It struggled to get even top 64 placements and had 0 top cuts. Dragapult Dusknoir being the best deck in the format at some points, and the lack of infinite resources or Heavy Ball made too big of a dent to repair. Also, the removal of permanent retreat locks like with Mawile or Snorlax made way less flexibility when finding lines for certain matchups. While Redeemable Ticket printed in Journey Together could fetch key cards out of the prizes, it was clearly a huge step down from Heavy Ball and Peonia in Control, because it also shuffled the top 6 of your deck into the prizes. So oftentimes you would play Ticket and then have to deal with other key cards becoming prized, making the game even harder to win in certain games. It's nice that there is at least a way to do this, but Ticket is so atrocious at what it does most of the time, especially in the early game, that prize card variance in Control is at arguably the worst it's ever been since before Peonia released in 2021. So with the history done, now it's time to get into the main reasons Control has turned into the most luck-based archetype in Pokemon. First, obviously, prize card variance. Redeemable Ticket is just not enough, and until we get a card like Heavy Ball, Gladion, or Peonia back, I think Control is seriously weaker than it could be. Second, deck space. Because Ticket is so bad, despite prize card recovery being possible, Control decks are almost forced to play 2 copies of key Pokemon right now. In the current format, playing 1 copy of Ethan's Sudowoodo, prizing it, and even if you have Redeemable Ticket in your deck, you still almost always lose the game for Control. Because in some matchups, especially more aggressive ones, playing 1 copy and prizing it means that you can't get it out of the prize cards fast enough to win the game. This makes playing 2, sadly, the best solution. But LGM also has the same problem and should be played at 2 copies in some matchups because it's so important and strong. But doing this kind of kills your surplus of tech spaces that Control decks need. And with no Hisuian Heavy Ball to act as an easily searchable second out, there's just a dead weight loss of deck space because of it. Third, accompanying Flute being so good. Flute is an item card that reveals the top 5 of the opponent's deck, lets you bench any number of basic Pokemon there, and shuffles the rest of the cards back in. This card is a must-have in Control and has been since its release because of how much pressure it applies and how rewarding hitting one is. However, that's also its biggest flaw. Often the main win condition for Control in some matchups is to either hit a Flute or an Erica's Invitation and go from there. But since Erica is so much easier to play around than Flute is often the only way you're going to have a solid chance to get a liability in play versus a good player. But because it can whiff so often, it turns the game into essentially a slot machine where you need to get lucky in order to win every time. The biggest example I can give is with Snorlax. With Echoing Horn and Erica's Invitation, a pin was created that was so solid and hard to play around that liabilities were easy to get into play. And with the Lure module being easy to tech in, this caused most of the deck's strength. However, once Horn rotated, Mantine was used for the same purpose and worked well enough to win a regional championship. However, once Flute released in Twilight Masquerade, Lax players had no reason not to play 3 or 4 Flute in their deck because it synergized so well in it and could technically create an even better pin if you played Mantine and Erica. However, the deck did need space for the new Flutes, and it would eventually come at the cost of Mantine first, since with Flute, Mantine was seen as inferior. But this quote-unquote upgrade did hurt consistency sometimes, since it made playing around Lax easier, and it also turned Lax games into a game of solitaire, giving the opponent a better chance of victory than they might have had with Mantine in the deck. Eventually, players would also cut Erica's Invitation for a short period of time, and once the trend caught on, Lax became even easier to play around, and despite being well positioned in some metas, like the Surging Sparks meta, results did not come as close to as good as before Flute released. Ironically, Snorlax might have been a worse overall deck because of a direct buff it received. But I might make a separate video on this, so let me know if you want a deeper dive. Anyways, because Flute was so strong when it hit, Pidgeot Control started to lean less into an endgame sweeper win condition like it did before release, and more into a retreat lock with Mawile and Wellspring. Before Flute released, Bird Control was winning regionals as arguably the best deck in the format right before Flute. After, its results became less consistent, less good players played the deck, and I can't help but think it was because of the consistency, or rather inconsistency and reliance on accompanying Flute. Fourth, overall deck consistency. The engines of Control decks have varied greatly throughout history, but right now the options we have, even Pidgeot, have so many flaws with consistency that it makes setting up almost every game harder than it was in the past. Play Pidgeot? Okay, but now you have to deal with about 1 in every 5 to 10 games resulting in a loss because of a brick. Play Dunsparce? Well, now you just pray you draw into big combos instead of being able to search out your text, and if you whiff, you almost always lose the game. Play anything else, and your deck pretty much sucks. The engines available ever since the rotation of Rotom V and Forest Sealstone haven't been reliable enough to allow for a perfect blend of consistency and minimal deck space used towards said consistency. And fifth, in my opinion, the most important factor for why Control is now the most luck-based archetype in the game is actually one of the only factors that's remained mostly constant since the beginning: the time rules. Now, at first glance, 50 minutes plus 1 extra turn is good for Control, since Control takes a long time to finish game 1, and if you win game 1, you are on pace to win the set by time. What happens if you lose game 1, even if you lose game 1 on the first turn? Well, now you mathematically can't win the set versus a good player, and are forced to either settle for a tie or take the loss if you also lost game 2. This makes the room for error with Control so low that you quite literally can't afford to make a big mistake, and even if you play perfectly, one mid-opening hand or too many flute misses, and your 80-10 matchup is now at best a tie. The time rules force your deck to be super consistent, but current Pidgeot Control lists are so inconsistent that if you want to be more consistent, you have to sacrifice strength, and if you sacrifice strength, good luck beating anything, let alone everything as you plan to do. With Control decks, the matchup spreads are often inflated to benefit Control at regionals because of how many bad players play in the early rounds and end up losing to Control because they don't know what to do. So for a better statistical overview, looking at Worlds and Day 2 of regionals usually shows just how polarizing the matchup spreads are. At the top tables, a good matchup is usually either a tie or a win, and a bad matchup is pretty much a guaranteed loss versus good players. This makes deep top cut runs with Control way less feasible than other archetypes, not even to mention how Control is almost always one of the lowest usage archetypes in Standard, with some exceptions like Block Snorlax that were easier to pilot for average players than decks like Pidgeot with 31 ofs. So in other words, the time rules only favor Control if you win game 1, but if you lose, your best outcome is a tie. And even if you lose a 10-minute game in Top Cut, your chances of winning the set drop to nearly zero, since in Top Cut the leader in prizes wins the game that ends when time is called, meaning that most Control decks aren't able to win. But time rules have stayed the same for largely the entire history I've talked about, so what is the big problem? Well, it's that time rules amplify the issues I just discussed. If you miss enough flutes one game, the time rules screw you over. You have really bad prize cards one game, and the time rules make it impossible to win. You brick one game, and now you cannot win the set. Every problem is basically just exemplified even more by the time rules, and it makes winning more difficult than ever before. However, it is possible to win and win a tournament with enough good luck. And that's kind of the point of this video, isn't it? What if you hit every flute? What if you dodge every bad matchup? What if you never have bad prize cards? What if you never brick? Well, if your deck is built correctly, you're probably going to win. But the odds of everything going your way being so low makes winning tournaments with Control today less reliant on having skillful pilots and more reliant than ever on having a streak of good luck.